His girlfriend ordered him to leave the hospital, but when he discovers what she did, no one ever imagines that the worst betrayal of their life will happen under fluorescent hospital lights, surrounded by strangers who pretend not to notice. Yet for Daniel Carter, that was exactly where everything began to unravel. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, the kind that settles into your bones. Machines beeped softly in distant rooms, footsteps echoed against polished floors, and time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Daniel sat in a plastic chair near the emergency ward, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture calm despite the exhaustion weighing on his face. He looked like any ordinary man waiting on medical news, plain clothes, tired eyes, no outward sign of importance. That was precisely why no one paid him much attention. Across from him stood his girlfriend, Vanessa Holt. She was impossible to miss. Her tailored coat fit her perfectly, expensive without being loud. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor every time she shifted her weight, a sound that carried authority. Nurses glanced at her and straightened instinctively. Administrators smiled politely. People like Vanessa were used to being obeyed. She had money, influence, and a presence that demanded space. Daniel had loved that confidence once. Now, as he watched her pacing impatiently, he felt something colder growing in his chest. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa snapped, checking her phone for the third time in a minute. "I've already been here too long." Daniel looked up slowly. "They said the tests would only take a little longer." Vanessa exhaled sharply, like someone deeply inconvenienced. "Daniel, listen to me. You fainted from stress. That's all. You're fine." "I collapsed," he corrected quietly. "In public." "And you embarrassed yourself," she replied without hesitation, her voice low but sharp. "Do you know how that looks?" That was the moment something shifted. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply studied her face, the perfectly applied makeup, the eyes that held no concern, only irritation. Around them, a few people pretended not to listen, but every word hung in the air. "I just want to hear what the doctor says," Daniel replied. Vanessa stopped pacing and turned toward him fully. Her expression hardened. "No. You're leaving." Daniel blinked. "What?" "You're leaving the hospital. Now," she said as if giving instructions to an employee. "I've already spoken to the front desk. You're discharged." A nurse nearby shifted uncomfortably. Daniel noticed, but Vanessa didn't care. "I didn't agree to that," Daniel said slowly. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice but sharpening every word. "You don't need to agree. I handled it. You don't need to be here, and frankly, I don't have time for this drama." Daniel stood up, not aggressively but with quiet resolve. "Vanessa, this is my health." She laughed softly, a humorless sound. "Your health? Daniel, you work too hard because you choose to. That's not an illness. That's poor judgment." The words cut deeper than she realized, or maybe exactly as deep as she intended. "I'm staying," Daniel said. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She glanced toward the nurse's station, then back at him. "Fine. Then I'll make this simple." She walked away without another word. Daniel watched her heels disappear around the corner, a strange mix of confusion and relief washing over him. For the first time in months there was silence between them. He sat back down, heart pounding, not from stress but from something far more unsettling. 10 minutes later, a security guard approached. "Sir," the guard said politely, though his eyes avoided Daniel's. "I'm going to need you to leave the emergency waiting area." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "Hospital policy. Family only." "I am the patient," Daniel replied evenly. "I haven't been discharged." The guard hesitated, glancing toward the nurse's station. "I was told otherwise." Daniel stood again. "By whom?" Before the guard could answer, Vanessa returned, this time with a hospital administrator at her side. The administrator wore a practiced smile, the kind meant to defuse conflict quickly. "Mr. Carter," the administrator said, "there seems to have been some confusion. According to our records, you're cleared to leave." Daniel stared at her. "I never signed anything." Vanessa crossed her arms. "I did. As your emergency contact." Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, not from dizziness but disbelief. "You forged my consent?" he asked quietly. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. I helped you. You don't belong in a hospital bed over something so trivial." Daniel looked around. No one met his eyes. Not the nurse. Not the guard. Not the administrator. Power had already spoken. "I want to stay," Daniel said again, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. The administrator sighed. Sir, if you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to escort you out. Vanessa leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That was when Daniel understood. This wasn't concern. This wasn't impatience. This was control. He picked up his jacket slowly, his movements deliberate. As the guard stepped aside to let him pass, Daniel paused and looked back at Vanessa. I trusted you, he said softly. She shrugged. You'll thank me later. Daniel walked out of the hospital alone, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a hollow finality. The night air was cold, biting through his clothes, but it felt cleaner than the room he'd left behind. He sat on a bench outside the hospital, hands clasped tightly, replaying every moment. His body still felt weak, but his mind was painfully clear. Something was wrong, not just with his health but with his life. What Daniel didn't know, what Vanessa never imagined, was that her impatience had just set off a chain of consequences she couldn't stop. Because the man she'd dismissed as weak, the man she'd ordered out of a hospital, was not who she thought he was at all. And soon everyone would find out. Daniel didn't go home that night. After leaving the hospital, he sat on the cold bench for nearly an hour, watching ambulances arrive and depart, their red lights painting the pavement in brief flashes of urgency. Every pulse of light felt like a reminder that he had been denied care, not by a broken system but by someone who claimed to love him. When he finally stood, his legs felt steady enough to walk, but his chest still ached with a pressure that had nothing to do with his body. He hailed a ride and gave the driver an address he rarely visited anymore. A small apartment across town, quiet, anonymous, untouched by Vanessa's world. The apartment belonged to Marcus Reed. Marcus opened the door with a look of instant concern. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed casually, the kind of man who looked unremarkable until you noticed how observant his eyes were. He'd known Daniel since college, before success, before titles, before Vanessa. You look like hell, Marcus said bluntly, stepping aside. Come in. Daniel didn't argue. He sank onto the couch, exhaling slowly. Marcus didn't ask questions right away. He poured water, handed it to him, and waited. That was always his way. She made them throw me out, Daniel finally said. Marcus's expression darkened. Who? Vanessa. The hospital. Silence filled the room. She signed discharge papers without my consent, Daniel continued. Told them I was fine. Told them to escort me out. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's illegal. Daniel nodded. I know. For the first time that night, anger crept through the numbness. Not explosive anger, but something colder, more focused. What else? Marcus asked. Daniel hesitated. She's been doing things. Quietly. Decisions. Without telling me. Marcus leaned forward. Like what? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. She's been calling people. Canceling meetings. Redirecting accounts. I thought it was just her trying to help me manage stress. Marcus let out a low breath. Daniel, you gave her access, didn't you? Yes, Daniel admitted. Limited access. Or so I thought. Marcus stood up and grabbed his laptop. Then we need to check something. Now. As the screen lit up, Daniel felt a familiar sensation return. The one he felt before major negotiations, before high-stakes decisions. Focus. Clarity. Control. Within minutes, Marcus found it. His hands froze over the keyboard. Daniel, he said carefully, she didn't just manage your schedule. Daniel leaned forward. What did she do? Marcus turned the screen toward him. Vanessa had contacted the board. She hadn't just spoken on his behalf. She had framed him as unstable. Overworked. A liability. She had suggested that Daniel needed time away, that his condition was worse than reported, that stepping back from leadership would be responsible. She had even submitted a request, unofficial but deliberate, to initiate temporary authority transfer. To herself. Daniel stared at the screen, his breathing slow, controlled. Every word felt like a calculated betrayal. She told them you collapsed from severe mental strain, Marcus said. Implied you were unfit to make decisions right now. Daniel's hands clenched. So that's why she wanted me out of the hospital, he murmured. A paper trail would have contradicted her story. Marcus nodded grimly. She needed you quiet. Invisible. Cooperative. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes. For years, Vanessa had stood beside him in public. Polished, supportive, admired. People assumed she was the reason for his success. Few knew the truth. Daniel Carter had built everything himself. From nothing. What no one saw was the boy who grew up in a one-bedroom apartment, the teenager who worked nights while studying finance, the man who turned down shortcuts because he refused to become what had once exploited him. Vanessa had entered his life later, after the headlines, after the wealth. She liked power. She liked proximity to influence. And she liked control. "You're not powerless," Marcus said quietly. "Not even close." Daniel opened his eyes. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn. His body still needed rest, but his mind was sharp. He showered, dressed simply, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, something he hadn't used in years. He wrote 3 names, 3 institutions, and one word beneath them: truth. By mid-morning, Vanessa was already moving. She sat in a sleek cafe downtown, phone pressed to her ear, her voice smooth and practiced. "Yes, I understand," she said. Daniel's condition was alarming. "I'm just trying to protect the company." She smiled politely at the waiter as she ended the call. To anyone watching, she looked like a devoted partner stepping up in a crisis. She didn't know Daniel had already started calling people too. But unlike Vanessa, Daniel wasn't calling to manipulate. He was calling to clarify. By noon, the first crack appeared. A board member requested documentation. By early afternoon, another asked for a medical report. Vanessa brushed it off, confident. She had influence. She always did. Until her phone rang. A known number. She answered casually. "Hello. Ms. Holt," a calm voice said. "This is Dr. Nguyen from the hospital." Vanessa's smile faltered. "Yes. There's a discrepancy in last night's discharge process," the doctor continued. "We need to clarify who authorized it." Vanessa's fingers tightened around her cup. "I did. As his emergency contact." There was a pause. "Mr. Carter was conscious and explicitly refused discharge," Dr. Nguyen said evenly. "That was documented." Vanessa's stomach dropped. "And," the doctor added, "Mr. Carter has requested a full review." The line went dead. For the first time in a long while, Vanessa felt something unfamiliar. Fear. That evening, Daniel stood in his own office for the first time in days. The building was quiet. Empty. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Marcus stood beside him. "Once this goes public, it'll get ugly." Daniel nodded. "I know. You ready?" Daniel looked out over the city he'd helped reshape, not with brute force but with patience, ethics, and resilience. "Yes," he said. "Because this isn't just about me." He turned back toward the desk, picking up a folder marked Internal Review. "It's about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness." The boardroom had never felt so cold. Vanessa sat at the long polished table, her posture flawless, her expression carefully neutral. She wore a navy blazer that projected calm authority, the kind that had always worked in rooms like this. Around her sat men and women who had once greeted her warmly, nodded along with her opinions, deferred to her presence. Now they watched her. Waiting. Daniel hadn't arrived yet. And that silence, heavy, expectant, was unnerving. "This meeting was requested to clarify recent actions," said Eleanor Brooks, one of the senior board members. "Specifically, decisions made in Mr. Carter's name." Vanessa offered a sympathetic smile. "Of course. As I've explained, Daniel's health." The doors opened. Every head turned. Daniel walked in calmly, dressed simply, no suit jacket, no tie. He looked thinner than usual, paler perhaps, but his eyes were steady, focused. There was no anger in his face, only resolve. Vanessa's breath caught for half a second. "Daniel," she said quickly, standing. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel didn't respond to her. He walked to the head of the table and placed a folder down gently. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. The room went silent. Eleanor cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, we were under the impression you were unwell." "I was," Daniel replied evenly. "I collapsed from exhaustion. Not incapacity." He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Vanessa for the first time. "And I was removed from the hospital against my will." A murmur rippled through the room. Vanessa laughed softly, trying to disarm the tension. "Daniel, this isn't necessary. You're confused." Daniel finally looked directly at her. "No. I'm informed." He opened the folder and slid copies across the table. "Hospital documentation," he continued. "Recorded statements. Security footage. And a signed statement from the attending physician." Vanessa's smile froze. "You told this board I was unstable," Daniel said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "You told them I needed to step aside. You told them you were acting in my best interest." He paused. You never once asked me what I wanted. The weight of his words settled heavily. Eleanor leaned forward. Miss Holt, did you authorize his discharge? Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. I believed it was necessary, she said carefully. Despite the patient refusing? Eleanor pressed. Vanessa shifted in her chair. I was concerned. Daniel's voice cut through gently, but sharply. You were concerned I would contradict you. Gasps followed. One board member exchanged glances with another. This is ridiculous, Vanessa snapped suddenly, losing her composure. I have stood beside this company for years. I've supported Daniel through everything. Daniel nodded slowly. You stood beside me when it benefited you. Silence. He continued, each word deliberate. You made decisions without consent. You interfered with medical care. You misrepresented facts to seize control. Vanessa stood abruptly. You're twisting this. No, Eleanor said firmly. He's clarifying it. Daniel turned back to the board. I take responsibility for giving her access. That was my mistake. But manipulation isn't partnership. Vanessa's voice rose. After everything I've done for you? Daniel's gaze softened, not with forgiveness but finality. Love doesn't look like control. The room was still. Eleanor closed her folder. Ms. Holt, effective immediately, your access to company communications is suspended pending investigation. Vanessa stared at her. You can't be serious. I am, Eleanor replied. Vanessa turned to Daniel, her eyes blazing. You're humiliating me. Daniel's voice was quiet. You humiliated yourself the moment you chose power over integrity. Security appeared at the door, not to remove Vanessa but to stand present. Watchful. Vanessa gathered her bag with shaking hands. For the first time since anyone in that room had known her, she looked small. As she walked past Daniel, she hissed, You'll regret this. Daniel didn't turn. After she left, the board remained silent. Finally, Marcus, who had been observing from the corner, spoke. There's one more thing. He stepped forward, connecting his laptop to the screen. Ms. Holt attempted to initiate an unauthorized authority transfer, Marcus explained. It failed because Mr. Carter retained final oversight. Pause. But had he remained hospitalized longer, it might not have. The implication hit hard. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Thank you for bringing this forward. Daniel nodded. I didn't do this to punish her. Then why? Someone asked. Daniel looked around the room. Because no one should be erased while they're vulnerable. That afternoon the story spread, not publicly yet, but through the quiet channels that shaped reputation. Vanessa Holt, once admired, was now spoken of cautiously. With raised eyebrows. With doubt. And Daniel? People saw him differently now. Not as a quiet executive behind the scenes. But as a man who had endured betrayal without becoming bitter. That evening, Daniel returned to the hospital, this time by choice. The same bench. The same doors. Dr. Nguyen met him personally. We should have protected you better, she said sincerely. Daniel smiled faintly. Thank you for protecting the truth. As he lay in the hospital bed, receiving proper care at last, Daniel felt something unexpected. Not because justice had been served, but because he had reclaimed himself. Vanessa Holt had never known silence like this. Her phone, once alive with constant notifications, sat motionless on the marble counter of her apartment. No calls. No messages. No invitations. The city outside her floor-to-ceiling windows moved on without her, indifferent and unforgiving. By morning, the investigation was no longer private. It never stayed that way. A single inquiry became three. Three became a quiet internal audit. And audits, when they involve power and betrayal, have a way of leaking into places they were never meant to reach. Vanessa watched the news from her couch, wrapped in a silk robe that suddenly felt ridiculous. The anchor's tone was careful, restrained, but the words were unmistakable. Sources confirmed that a senior executive associate is under review for misrepresentation of medical information and unauthorized corporate actions. Her name wasn't mentioned. Yet. Vanessa muted the television, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone again. She scrolled through her contacts, stopping on names that once guaranteed protection. No one answered. She tried a different approach. She drove to the company building. Security stopped her at the entrance. I'm sorry, Ms. Holt, the guard said politely. Your access has been suspended. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. I've walked through these doors for years. Yes, ma'am, he replied evenly. But not today. The humiliation burned deeper than anger ever could. Across town, Daniel was recovering in a quiet hospital room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, warm and steady. Marcus sat nearby reviewing documents. "You're trending," Marcus said, glancing up. "Not publicly, but among people who matter." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I don't want a spectacle." "You're not getting one," Marcus replied. "You're getting accountability." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since the collapse, his body felt aligned with his mind. Stronger. Clear. Meanwhile, Vanessa's world continued to shrink. Sponsors pulled away. Invitations were rescinded. A charity board she once chaired asked her to step back temporarily. Even friends, people who had laughed beside her at galas, suddenly remembered being busy. The final blow came in the form of a letter. Official. Legal. Unavoidable. It detailed the findings so far: coercion, falsified consent, attempted misuse of authority. No charges yet, but consequences were already unfolding. Vanessa sank into a chair, the letter slipping from her fingers. She had always believed she was indispensable. Now she was expendable. Desperate, she did the one thing she swore she never would. She went to the hospital. Daniel was standing by the window when she entered the room. He turned slowly, unsurprised. "You look well," Vanessa said stiffly. "I am," Daniel replied. She swallowed. "You didn't have to do this." Daniel met her gaze calmly. "I didn't." "You did." Her voice cracked. "I was protecting us." "No," he said gently. "You were protecting yourself." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything that could no longer be undone. "They're destroying me," Vanessa whispered. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't gloat. "That's not what's happening," he said. "What's happening is that people finally see you clearly." Tears welled in her eyes. "Please, call them. Say it was a misunderstanding." Daniel shook his head once. "I won't lie to make you comfortable." Her shoulders slumped. As she turned to leave, she paused. "You could have been nothing without me." Daniel's voice stopped her. "I was everything before you," he said quietly. "I just forgot for a while." Vanessa left without another word. Days later, the story broke publicly. Not sensational. Not cruel. Just factual. A powerful woman misused influence. A man was silenced while vulnerable. And the truth corrected the imbalance. Messages poured in for Daniel, from employees, from strangers, from people who had once been overlooked themselves. He read one message twice before setting the phone down. "Thank you for showing that dignity is stronger than control." Daniel smiled faintly. Justice didn't roar. It arrived calmly, firmly, and stayed. The city moved differently after the truth came out. It wasn't louder. It wasn't dramatic. But something had shifted beneath the surface, like a long-held breath finally released. People spoke more carefully, listened more closely, paid attention to details they had once ignored. Daniel noticed it immediately. When he returned to work weeks later, fully recovered, medically cleared, and stronger than before, the atmosphere had changed. Employees didn't just greet him with professional respect anymore. They greeted him with something warmer, something earned. They had seen what happened when power was abused. They had seen who stood firm without cruelty. And that mattered. Daniel didn't hold a press conference. He didn't give interviews. He declined every invitation to tell his side on public platforms. Instead, he focused on rebuilding trust quietly, internally, deliberately. His first major decision surprised everyone. He ordered a complete review of emergency decision protocols, not just in his company but in partner institutions, hospitals, contractors, corporate emergency contacts. No one, he told the board, should lose autonomy the moment they become vulnerable. Policies were rewritten. Safeguards added. Consent protection strengthened. The ripple spread farther than anyone expected. Meanwhile, Vanessa Holt disappeared from the circles she once dominated. Her apartment was sold. Her name quietly removed from boards and committees. Friends who once relied on her influence now avoided her entirely. Not out of cruelty, but caution. Power had left her hands. And with it, the illusion that she had ever been untouchable. One afternoon, Daniel received an email forwarded by Marcus. It was brief. Vanessa had accepted full responsibility as part of a settlement agreement. No public apology. No dramatic statement. Just acknowledgement. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. He felt no satisfaction. Only closure. Weeks later, Daniel returned to the same hospital, not as a patient but as a donor. He funded a new patient advocacy office, independent from administrative pressure. A place where people without influence could be heard. At the opening, a young nurse approached him nervously. "My brother was treated unfairly once," she said. "He didn't have anyone to speak for him." Daniel smiled gently. "Now he does." That night, Daniel stood alone on his balcony, overlooking the city. The same skyline that once symbolized success now meant something different. Resilience, integrity, quiet strength. He thought about how easily everything could have gone another way, how close he had come to being erased from his own life, and how the smallest act of resistance, refusing to leave, refusing to stay silent, had changed everything. Justice hadn't arrived with applause. It arrived with balance. Daniel didn't win because Vanessa lost. He won because he reclaimed his voice. And the world listened.